So, there I was, getting a $50,000 fine from HOA President Karen Williams because my 150-year-old Victorian mansion didn't meet modern aesthetic standards. What she didn't know is that my house is a federally protected historic landmark, and I'm a historic preservation attorney who specializes in taking down people who try to destroy American heritage for profit. Her little power trip was about to become a federal crime that would cost her everything, including a prison sentence that would make her wish she'd never heard of historic preservation laws. But first, what would you do if some power-hungry neighbor tried to force you to destroy a piece of American history because it didn't match their cookie-cutter vision of suburban perfection? Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from, because this story is about to expose how criminals use HOA authority to commit heritage destruction for personal gain. Let me paint you the picture of how this nightmare started, because what happened next will make your blood boil with righteous fury. My name is Charles Morrison, and 6 months ago, I thought I'd finally found the perfect balance between my career as a federal historic preservation attorney and my personal passion for saving America's architectural heritage. After spending 15 years fighting developers who wanted to tear down historic buildings for strip malls and parking lots, I'd earned enough to purchase my dream property, the magnificent Ashworth Victorian Mansion in Millbrook Heights, Pennsylvania. This isn't just any old house. This is a masterpiece of 1870s architecture that has been continuously occupied for over 150 years. Built by railroad magnate Jonathan Ashworth using the finest craftsmen and materials money could buy, the mansion features hand-carved walnut staircases, original Tiffany stained glass windows, and ornate plasterwork that would cost millions to recreate today. Every room tells the story of American craftsmanship when quality and beauty mattered more than speed and profit. The house sits on 3 acres of meticulously maintained gardens that include original Victorian landscaping, a carriage house that's been converted into my law office, and a historic greenhouse where the Ashworth family grew exotic orchids imported from around the world. The property is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, protected by federal landmark status, and covered by preservation easements that legally prohibit any alterations that would compromise its historic integrity. For the first 5 months, life at Ashworth Mansion was everything I dreamed it would be. I woke up every morning surrounded by authentic Victorian splendor, worked in a carriage house office that inspired my preservation law practice, and spent evenings researching the fascinating history of my home and the prominent families who had lived there. The neighbors were mostly other history enthusiasts who appreciated living near such an important piece of American architectural heritage. Then Karen Williams moved into the neighborhood and decided that my 150-year-old mansion was ruining her modern suburban aesthetic vision. She's 48 years old, former real estate developer, and the kind of woman who sees historic architecture as outdated obstacles to maximizing property values through bland uniformity. She drives a white Tesla Model X that she parks in front of my house while taking photos of what she calls violations of community appearance standards. Karen's background in real estate development gave her a dangerous combination of construction knowledge and financial ruthlessness. She understood property values, zoning regulations, and building codes well enough to sound authoritative when making demands about architectural modifications. What she didn't understand was federal historic preservation law, the National Historic Preservation Act, or the serious criminal penalties for attempting to destroy federally protected landmarks. The first violation notice appeared on a Tuesday morning, taped to my front door like a declaration of war against American heritage, bright red paper with bold black lettering that screamed, "Immediate compliance required." The complaint was breathtaking in its ignorance and cultural vandalism. My mansion's original Victorian paint scheme apparently violated the community's neutral color palette requirements. The ornate gingerbread trim was classified as excessive decorative elements that disrupted neighborhood visual harmony. The fine was $25,000, payable within 30 days, or face architectural modification enforcement proceedings. I read the notice 3 times, each reading making me more incredulous and professionally outraged. Someone was demanding that I destroy original Victorian architectural details and repaint a National Historic Landmark to match the beige mediocrity of modern subdivision houses. It was like demanding that the Statue of Liberty be painted pink to match someone's personal decorating preferences. The ignorance was staggering. The cultural vandalism was breathtaking. This woman was literally trying to force me to commit federal crimes against historic preservation for her aesthetic preferences. But this wasn't just about my house. This was about the broader war between preserving American architectural heritage and the relentless march of suburban conformity that destroys everything unique and beautiful in favor of bland profitability. As a historic preservation attorney, I'd seen this pattern countless times. Developers and HOA tyrants using bureaucratic harassment to force property owners to destroy irreplaceable pieces of American history. The next morning, I drove to my law office in the carriage house and began researching Karen's legal authority to make demands about my federally protected property. What I found was exactly what I expected. She had absolutely no legal standing to regulate a national historic landmark. Federal preservation laws supersede all local regulations, including HOA covenants. Karen's demands weren't just unenforceable. They were invitations to commit federal crimes. I called the National Park Service's Historic Preservation Division and spoke with Dr. James Richardson, a federal preservation officer who specialized in landmark protection enforcement. He listened to my description of Karen's demands with the controlled fury of someone who'd spent his career watching ignorant people try to destroy irreplaceable pieces of American heritage. "Charles," he said, his voice carrying the authority of decades fighting cultural vandalism, "this woman is asking you to violate federal law by destroying protected historic fabric. The National Historic Preservation Act makes it a federal crime to alter, damage, or destroy elements of a registered landmark without specific federal approval. What she's demanding would result in federal charges, massive fines, and potential prison time for anyone who complied with her ignorant demands." Dr. Richardson's words were both reassuring and sobering. Karen wasn't just harassing me with unenforceable HOA demands. She was asking me to commit federal crimes that could destroy my legal career and result in criminal prosecution. Her ignorance about federal preservation law was so complete that she didn't realize she was demanding that I participate in heritage destruction that violated multiple federal statutes. "Can you work with me to document everything she does from now on?" Dr. Richardson asked. "We need to build a case that will not only stop her harassment, but also send a clear message that attempting to destroy national historic landmarks will result in serious federal consequences. Your situation could help protect thousands of other historic properties from similar attacks, if we handle this correctly." I looked out my carriage house office window at the magnificent mansion that had survived 150 years of wars, economic crashes, and social changes, only to face destruction demands from a suburban tyrant who thought federal landmarks should conform to her personal decorating preferences. The idea that someone could force me to destroy this irreplaceable piece of American heritage was both terrifying and infuriating. The harassment escalated quickly once Karen realized that I wasn't going to pay her fraudulent fine and start destroying my historic mansion to match her subdivision aesthetic. The second violation notice arrived 1 week later, this time delivered by a process server who seemed embarrassed to be participating in obvious legal nonsense. Karen had escalated from demanding cosmetic changes to requiring structural modifications that would have been cultural vandalism on a massive scale. This notice was even more outrageous than the first. My mansion's original slate roof apparently violated modern material requirements and needed to be replaced with standard asphalt shingles. The hand-carved Victorian porch columns were classified as non-conforming structural elements that required replacement with simple square posts. The ornate bay windows needed to be replaced with standard rectangular windows that matched neighborhood uniformity standards. The total cost of these demanded destructions exceeded $100,000. The ignorance behind these demands was staggering even by Karen's standards. She was essentially ordering me to strip away every element that made the mansion historically significant and replace them with generic modern materials that would destroy its landmark status forever. She wanted me to turn a national historic landmark into a bland suburban house that looked like every other cookie-cutter home in her preferred aesthetic vision. I called Dr. Richardson immediately and read him the new violation notice. His response was immediate and furious. This woman is now demanding systematic destruction of protected historic fabric on a scale that would constitute one of the worst heritage crimes in Pennsylvania history. She's asking you to commit federal felonies that would result in decades of prison time and millions of dollars in fines. This isn't harassment anymore. This is conspiracy to commit federal crimes against cultural heritage. The documentation process began immediately. Dr. Richardson connected me with federal investigators who specialized in heritage crime enforcement. We installed security cameras around my property to record any future harassment or attempted vandalism. I started keeping detailed records of every interaction with Karen, including her specific demands for destroying federally protected architectural elements. Most importantly, we began building a federal case that would expose Karen's demands as criminal conspiracy to destroy national historic landmarks. The evidence was clear and legally devastating. Karen was systematically demanding that I commit federal crimes to satisfy her personal aesthetic preferences. Her ignorance about preservation law wouldn't protect her from criminal charges once federal prosecutors became involved. The investigation revealed that I wasn't Karen's first target. She had previously harassed the owners of 2 other historic properties in the area, both of whom had eventually sold their homes rather than fight her bureaucratic terrorism. One was the owner of an 1880s farmhouse who had been fined repeatedly for maintaining original board and batten siding instead of installing modern vinyl. Another was the owner of a 1920s craftsman bungalow who had been threatened with foreclosure for refusing to replace original hardwood floors with modern laminate. Both property owners had been too overwhelmed and financially strained by Karen's harassment to understand that they had federal protection that superseded all local regulations. They had assumed that HOA demands automatically overrode historic preservation rights. They had believed that fighting back would only make their situations worse. They had been exactly the kind of vulnerable targets that cultural vandals like Karen relied on to avoid consequences for their heritage destruction campaigns. The pattern was clear and legally devastating. Karen wasn't just enforcing community aesthetic standards. She was systematically targeting historic properties and demanding their destruction to create the bland uniformity she preferred. She was weaponizing HOA authority to commit cultural genocide against America's architectural heritage, one irreplaceable building at a time. 3 weeks after the second violation notice, Karen made the mistake that would end her heritage destruction campaign forever. She hired a demolition company to begin emergency structural modifications on my property while I was attending a preservation law conference in Washington, D.C. She had convinced them that my mansion was in imminent danger of collapse and required immediate intervention to protect public safety. I received a frantic call from my neighbor, Dr. Patricia Chen, a retired history professor who understood the mansion's significance. "Charles," she said, her voice shaking with outrage, "there are men with sledgehammers on your front porch trying to demolish your Victorian columns. They say they have authorization from the HOA to remove dangerous structural elements. I called the police, but they claim they have proper permits. I activated the emergency heritage protection protocol that Dr. Richardson had established and immediately contacted federal preservation enforcement. Within minutes, federal agents were coordinating with local police to stop what amounted to a federal crime in progress. My security cameras captured everything. Karen directing demolition crews to destroy federally protected architectural elements of a national historic landmark. The federal response was swift and overwhelming. U.S. Park Police, FBI, heritage crime investigators, and federal preservation officers descended on my property with emergency stop work orders backed by federal court injunctions. The demolition crew found themselves facing federal agents who explained that they were about to participate in heritage crimes that carried mandatory prison sentences. Karen's response to federal intervention was predictably delusional. She insisted that HOA authority superseded all other regulations, and that federal agents had no jurisdiction over community appearance standards. She demanded to see federal warrants while standing next to sledgehammer, damage to a national historic landmark. She threatened to sue the federal government for interfering with legitimate community management. Her ignorance was spectacular and legally suicidal. Federal agents patiently explained that attacking national historic landmarks was a federal crime, regardless of local HOA policies. They showed her the federal statutes that made her demands criminal conspiracy. They documented the actual damage her demolition crew had inflicted on irreplaceable Victorian architectural elements. The federal investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Karen's heritage destruction campaign. Her computer contained research files on dozens of historic properties throughout Pennsylvania, with detailed plans for forcing their owners to destroy protected architectural elements. She had been studying preservation law not to comply with it, but to find ways to circumvent federal protections and force property owners to commit heritage crimes. What federal investigators discovered in Karen's files shocked even experienced heritage crime prosecutors. She had been operating a sophisticated criminal enterprise that extended far beyond simple HOA harassment into organized attacks on America's cultural heritage. Her computer systems contained detailed databases of historic properties across 7 states, with comprehensive vulnerability assessments that read like military intelligence reports targeting cultural assets. Karen's operation had identified over 200 historic properties that she classified as high-value conversion targets, meaning historic buildings that could generate substantial profits if their owners could be forced to sell to developers for demolition and redevelopment. She had researched each property's historic significance, federal protection status, and the personal vulnerabilities of their owners that could be exploited through systematic harassment campaigns. The criminal network she had assembled was sophisticated and far-reaching. Federal agents discovered that Karen had been coordinating with corrupt building inspectors who would cite historic properties for fake code violations, dishonest real estate appraisers who would undervalue historic properties to facilitate forced sales, and demolition companies that specialized in emergency destruction of architecturally significant buildings before preservation advocates could intervene. Her financial records revealed that the heritage destruction enterprise had generated over $800,000 in criminal revenue over the past 3 years. Karen had been receiving bounty payments from developers for each historic property she successfully forced into sale, with bonuses based on the architectural significance of the buildings destroyed. A Victorian mansion demolished for a strip mall had earned her $25,000. A craftsman bungalow destroyed for a gas station had generated $15,000. An antebellum farmhouse bulldozed for a parking lot had brought her $30,000. The psychological evaluation ordered by federal prosecutors revealed a personality profile that combined cultural vandalism with financial sociopathy. Dr. Amanda Foster, who had previously evaluated heritage criminals, described Karen as displaying aggressive presentism, a pathological inability to value anything that existed before her own lifetime, combined with narcissistic beliefs that her aesthetic preferences should override centuries of cultural heritage. Karen's personal journals, discovered during the federal search, provided chilling insights into her motivations and methods. She wrote about historic buildings with contempt and disgust, describing them as architectural clutter and outdated obstacles to progress that prevented communities from achieving modern uniformity. She celebrated each successful demolition like a military victory, documenting the destruction of irreplaceable craftsmanship with cold satisfaction. One particularly disturbing entry described her strategy for targeting the elderly owners of an 1850s Greek Revival mansion. Karen had researched the owner's medical conditions and financial vulnerabilities, then timed her harassment campaign to coincide with the wife's chemotherapy treatments. She documented how the stress of fighting her demands had accelerated the woman's decline, ultimately forcing the family to sell their ancestral home to pay medical bills. Another journal entry detailed her campaign against a young couple who had inherited a Civil War-era farmhouse. Karen had studied their employment situations and student loan burdens, then created harassment demands that she knew they couldn't afford to fight legally. She timed her escalations to coincide with their mortgage payment schedules, knowing that the financial pressure would force them to choose between keeping their historic home and maintaining their credit ratings. The federal grand jury investigation that followed exposed corruption extending through multiple levels of state and local government. Karen had been paying bribes to building inspectors, code enforcement officials, and even some planning board members to support her heritage destruction campaigns. These corrupt officials had been filing false reports about structural dangers, conducting illegal inspections, and issuing emergency demolition orders for buildings that posed no actual safety threats. Special Agent Maria Rodriguez, who led the Federal Heritage Crime Task Force, explained the sophisticated nature of Karen's criminal network. This wasn't just one person harassing property owners about paint colors. This was an organized criminal enterprise that had weaponized government authority to destroy irreplaceable pieces of American cultural heritage for profit. The scope of heritage destruction she was planning would have been one of the worst cultural losses in Pennsylvania history. The coordinated federal response involved simultaneous raids on over 40 locations across 7 states, including Karen's headquarters, her co-conspirators' offices, corrupt government officials' homes, and the facilities of demolitionist companies that had participated in heritage destruction. Federal agents seized over $1.2 million in cash, hundreds of thousands of dollars in real estate assets, and enough documentary evidence to support prosecutions of 67 individuals involved in the heritage destruction network. The evidence collection from Karen's operation revealed the industrial scale of her cultural vandalism plans. She had converted her garage into a war room with architectural drawings of targeted historic buildings, marked with detailed demolition plans and replacement development proposals. Wall-mounted maps showed historic districts across multiple states, with individual landmarks marked according to their demolition, priority, and profit potential. Karen's computer systems contained architectural databases with detailed destruction plans for over 300 historic properties, including stolen architectural surveys, structural engineering reports, and demolition cost estimates. She had categorized buildings by architectural style, with separate destruction strategies for Victorian mansions, colonial farmhouses, craftsman bungalows, and Art Deco commercial buildings. Her research had been comprehensive and professionally sophisticated, rivaling cultural destruction operations conducted by wartime occupying forces. The civil lawsuit I filed against Karen and her criminal network expanded dramatically as federal investigators uncovered the full scope of the heritage destruction conspiracy. What began as a preservation law violation case evolved into a complex RICO lawsuit targeting multiple defendants, including developers, corrupt officials, and financial institutions that had helped launder Karen's criminal proceeds from cultural vandalism. The discovery phase of the expanded lawsuit revealed systematic violations of federal preservation law that extended far beyond individual harassment cases. Karen's network had been operating like a cultural destruction syndicate, with specialized roles for different participants. Some focused on identifying vulnerable historic properties through illegal access to architectural surveys and preservation reports. Others developed harassment strategies tailored to specific architectural styles and owner demographics. The expert witnesses who testified during the federal proceedings painted a devastating picture of the cultural and financial damage Karen's network had inflicted on historic preservation efforts. Dr. Michael Santos, America's leading authority on heritage crime, explained how Karen's destruction campaigns had been designed to exploit the specific vulnerabilities of historic property owners and the gaps in federal preservation law enforcement. Historic property owners often face unique financial challenges that make them vulnerable to harassment campaigns. Maintaining authentic period materials and traditional craftsmanship techniques is expensive, and many owners struggle with the costs of proper preservation, while also dealing with modern utility and safety requirements. Karen had researched these financial pressures and created harassment strategies that deliberately exploited owners' economic vulnerabilities. The testimony from preservation experts established that Karen's harassment campaigns constituted a form of cultural terrorism that threatened America's architectural heritage. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, director of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, explained how destroying original architectural elements was equivalent to burning historical documents or vandalizing museum artifacts. The interference with preservation efforts caused immediate and irreversible cultural losses that impoverished the entire nation's heritage. The prosecution's case was strengthened by testimony from federal agents who had infiltrated Karen's network during the investigation. Agent Michael Thompson had posed as a corrupt developer interested in acquiring historic properties for demolition and redevelopment. His undercover work revealed that Karen's operation had been expanding into new regions and developing increasingly sophisticated destruction strategies. Karen's network had been researching historic properties' legal vulnerabilities, including gaps in federal protection, owner financial distress, and local government corruption that could be exploited to facilitate heritage destruction. They had developed profiles of historic buildings that were most likely to be destroyed quickly when subjected to sustained harassment campaigns. They had even created assessment tools for predicting which architectural styles would generate the most profit when demolished for modern development. The undercover investigation also revealed that Karen had been training other individuals to replicate her methods in new markets. She had developed a comprehensive training program that taught participants how to research preservation law loopholes, create targeted harassment campaigns, and coordinate with corrupt officials to maximize cultural destruction. Her criminal enterprise had been operating like a franchise system, spreading heritage vandalism across multiple states. The trial proceedings revealed the sophisticated legal strategies Karen's network had developed to avoid prosecution for their heritage crimes. They had researched federal preservation law extensively, not to comply with it, but to find technicalities and procedural gaps that might provide cover for cultural destruction campaigns. They had developed seemingly legitimate pretexts for targeting historic architectural elements. Karen's defense team tried to argue that her activities constituted legitimate community management rather than heritage crime. They claimed that her violation notices and demolition demands were standard property management activities that applied equally to all buildings regardless of their historic significance. This defense strategy collapsed when prosecutors introduced evidence of Karen's specific research into architectural significance and her documented strategies for destroying federally protected elements. The prosecution demonstrated that Karen had never targeted modern buildings with similar harassment campaigns. Her violation notices were specifically designed to force destruction of architecturally significant elements. Her demolition demands were timed to coincide with preservation grant applications and landmark designation processes. Her enforcement activities were designed to destroy cultural heritage rather than maintain community standards. The jury was particularly influenced by testimony from Karen's own accomplices, who had cooperated with federal investigators in exchange for reduced sentences. These witnesses described planning meetings where Karen had discussed specific buildings' architectural significance and developed strategies for forcing their destruction before preservation advocates could intervene. They testified about Karen's celebrations when historic buildings were successfully demolished. Her conviction carried mandatory federal sentences totaling 32 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 20 years. The judge, the Honorable Patricia Rodriguez, explained during sentencing that heritage crimes required severe penalties because cultural destruction represented attacks on the entire nation's cultural identity, not merely individual property disputes. Judge Rodriguez's sentencing statement became a landmark judicial precedent for heritage crime prosecution. She explained that Karen's systematic targeting of American architectural heritage constituted a form of cultural terrorism that demanded federal intervention and serious criminal consequences. The judge noted that Karen's sophisticated criminal enterprise had threatened to eliminate entire categories of historical architecture from American communities. The financial penalties were equally comprehensive and devastating. Karen was ordered to pay complete restoration costs for all the heritage damage her network had caused, totaling over $4.7 million for historically accurate craftsmanship repairs across multiple properties. The restoration work required master craftsmen who specialized in period-appropriate techniques, making the costs astronomical and financially ruinous for Karen's criminal enterprise. The broader impact of Karen's prosecution created revolutionary changes in how federal agencies approach heritage crime investigation and prevention. The Department of Justice established the National Heritage Crime Task Force within the FBI, creating a specialized unit dedicated exclusively to investigating and prosecuting organized attacks on America's cultural heritage. The task force was granted enhanced investigative powers and congressional appropriations exceeding $50 million annually. Agent Maria Rodriguez, who had led the investigation, was promoted to head the new task force and testified before Congress about the nationwide scope of heritage destruction threats. Her testimony revealed that federal investigators had identified over 200 similar criminal networks operating across 43 states, representing the largest threat to American cultural heritage since the urban renewal demolitions of the 1960s. The congressional hearings that followed Karen's conviction brought unprecedented national attention to heritage crime and the systematic threats facing America's historic architecture. The House Subcommittee on Natural Resources conducted a comprehensive investigation that revealed the industrial scale of organized heritage destruction, with criminal networks generating hundreds of millions of dollars in illegal profits through cultural vandalism. Representative Michael Santos, chairman of the Heritage Protection Subcommittee, presented evidence that heritage destruction campaigns were being coordinated internationally, with American criminal networks sharing techniques and resources with similar organizations in Europe, Canada, and Australia. The globalization of heritage crime had created sophisticated networks that treated cultural history as obstacles to profitable development rather than irreplaceable human heritage. The legislative response was swift, comprehensive, and bipartisan. Congress passed the National Heritage Protection Act with overwhelming support from both parties, creating the strongest federal protections for historic architecture in American history. The law established mandatory minimum sentences of 15 years for heritage vandalism and up to 40 years for organized cultural destruction conspiracies like Karen's network. The Heritage Protection Act included revolutionary provisions for proactive federal oversight of communities with significant historic resources. Local governments and HOA organizations operating in historic districts would be subject to mandatory annual federal audits to ensure compliance with preservation laws. Communities that failed these audits would face federal intervention and potential criminal investigation of their governance practices. The legislation also created the National Heritage Crime Victim Compensation Fund, financed through criminal forfeiture proceeds from prosecuted cultural vandalism cases. The fund provided comprehensive support for property owners who had been victimized by heritage destruction campaigns, including full restoration funding, legal representation, and financial compensation for cultural losses that could never be fully repaired. Our neighborhood transformation after Karen's federal prosecution became a national model for historic district protection and community-based preservation advocacy. The Millbrook Heights Historic District received enhanced federal designation as a National Heritage Protection Demonstration Site, attracting preservationists, architects, cultural heritage experts, and federal officials from around the world who wanted to study our community-based approach to heritage protection. The community healing process involved extensive education about preservation law and the comprehensive federal protections that made our historic district legally inviolate against future destruction threats. The National Park Service established a permanent heritage protection clinic in our community that provided comprehensive legal support, educational resources, and advocacy training for historic property owners throughout the region. The Ashworth Mansion's restoration became an internationally recognized showcase for traditional Victorian craftsmanship techniques and materials. The damage Karen's demolition crew had inflicted was repaired using historically accurate methods and materials, with master craftsmen from around the country demonstrating skills that had been passed down through generations of specialized artisans. The restoration process was comprehensively documented and used to create training programs for new artisans learning traditional building techniques. The mansion became a living laboratory where researchers from major universities studied historical construction methods, materials, science, and preservation techniques that could be applied to similar properties nationwide. The Charles Morrison Historic Preservation Foundation, established using settlement money and federal grants, grew into one of the nation's premier organizations, providing legal support, educational resources, and advocacy for historic property owners facing destruction threats. The foundation's legal clinic provided free representation for property owners dealing with heritage harassment, while its educational programs trained thousands of people annually about preservation law and cultural heritage protection. The Foundation's research division conducted groundbreaking studies on heritage crime patterns, cultural vandalism techniques, and the economic factors that drive organized attempts to destroy historic architecture. Their research documented the sophisticated methods used by criminal organizations to identify and target vulnerable historic properties, and the complex financial networks that profit from cultural destruction while avoiding detection by law enforcement. The Foundation's early warning system, developed in partnership with federal agencies, created a nationwide network for identifying emerging heritage destruction threats before they could cause irreversible cultural losses. Property owners, preservation organizations, and law enforcement agencies could report suspicious activities through secure databases that enabled federal investigators to identify patterns indicating organized criminal activity. 10 years after Karen's conviction, the annual Historic Preservation Rights Conference held at Ashworth Mansion had become the premier international gathering for preservation attorneys, federal enforcement officials, cultural heritage organizations, and historic property owners. The conference attracted over 4,000 participants annually from 37 countries and generated policy recommendations that influenced federal legislation and international treaties protecting cultural heritage. The conference's impact extended far beyond American preservation efforts, creating international cooperation agreements for combating heritage crime across national borders. European, Canadian, and Australian law enforcement agencies established formal partnerships with American federal agencies to share intelligence about international heritage destruction networks and coordinate prosecutions of criminals who targeted cultural heritage for profit. The National Heritage Crime Database, established by the Foundation and maintained by federal agencies, became the primary global resource for tracking destruction attempts against historic properties and identifying emerging criminal networks before they could cause significant cultural losses. The database processed over 10,000 reports annually and had prevented an estimated $500 million in heritage destruction through early intervention and prosecution of criminal networks. 15 years after Karen first tried to force me to destroy my Victorian mansion, the transformation of heritage protection enforcement had created a comprehensive international defense system that had prevented the loss of thousands of historic buildings worldwide. Federal agencies had developed sophisticated investigation techniques for identifying cultural destruction networks across multiple jurisdictions. Prosecutors had clear legal frameworks for pursuing aggressive international prosecutions that resulted in serious prison sentences and massive financial penalties. Communities across multiple countries had implemented evidence-based programs for supporting historic property owners and preventing heritage harassment before it could escalate into cultural vandalism. Preservation organizations had effective tools for educating property owners about their federal rights and connecting them with legal resources when destruction threats occurred. The cultural understanding of historic preservation had evolved dramatically on both national and international levels. The public education campaigns that had grown out of Karen's prosecution had helped millions of people understand that historic buildings were irreplaceable cultural assets that deserve protection rather than obstacles to modern development. Architectural heritage was increasingly recognized as essential to community character, national identity, and human cultural development. The economic benefits of effective heritage protection had become undeniable through comprehensive studies conducted by the Foundation and federal agencies. Communities with strong preservation programs consistently showed higher property values, increased tourism revenue, enhanced quality of life metrics, and stronger cultural identity markers compared to areas where historic architecture had been eliminated. The Foundation's economic impact studies revealed that heritage protection generated substantial financial returns through increased property values, tourism development, skilled craftsmanship employment, and cultural education programs. Communities that had successfully defended their historic architecture against destruction campaigns showed average property value increases of 35% within 5 years, while areas that had lost significant historic buildings experienced economic decline and reduced cultural attraction. Bullies who target historic properties now face a coordinated international response that includes specialized prosecutors, enhanced criminal penalties, sophisticated investigation techniques, and international cooperation agreements that can identify and dismantle cultural destruction networks before they cause irreversible heritage losses. The legal precedents established through Karen's prosecution have created frameworks for aggressive enforcement that protect architectural heritage while sending clear messages to potential cultural vandals worldwide. The victory tastes sweeter than any legal success I achieved in my preservation practice, sweeter than the morning coffee I drink, surrounded by authentic Victorian splendor, sweeter than watching historic property owners across multiple nations learn to protect their irreplaceable architectural treasures through knowledge, legal support, and international cooperation. The mansion continues to stand as it has for over 150 years, now protected by comprehensive international law, community education, federal oversight, and the absolute certainty that anyone who attempts cultural destruction will face swift and devastating legal consequences that extend across national borders. The peace I found in this magnificent mansion has been enhanced by the knowledge that our victory protected thousands of other historic properties from similar destruction campaigns. My commitment to historic preservation continues every day, but now that work takes place within an international network of communities that understand and respect architectural heritage as irreplaceable human culture, the educational programs, legal resources, and federal protections that grew out of our battle against Karen's criminal network have created permanent safeguards that will protect America's architectural legacy for future generations. The Foundation's mentorship program has trained over 2,000 preservation advocates who now work in communities across 48 states and 12 countries. These advocates provide local expertise for identifying heritage threats, educating property owners about their rights, and coordinating with federal agencies when criminal intervention becomes necessary. The network has created a sustainable defense system that doesn't depend on individual heroes but operates through institutional knowledge and community-based advocacy. The international heritage protection treaties that resulted from our case have established binding agreements between nations for preventing cultural destruction and prosecuting heritage criminals who operate across borders. These treaties have created legal mechanisms for extraditing heritage criminals, sharing intelligence about destruction networks, and coordinating law enforcement responses to international threats against architectural heritage. The advanced warning systems developed through our experience now monitor social media, property records, and municipal filings for patterns that indicate emerging heritage destruction campaigns. Artificial intelligence algorithms analyze thousands of data points daily to identify suspicious activities before they can progress to actual vandalism attempts. These systems have prevented over 800 destruction campaigns in their early planning stages. 20 years after Karen's arrest, I received an invitation to address the United Nations Cultural Heritage Protection Assembly about sustainable approaches to architectural preservation in the modern world. The speech was part of a global initiative to establish universal standards for protecting human cultural heritage from organized criminal destruction. Representatives from 127 nations attended the assembly to develop binding international protocols. The UN Assembly adopted the Morrison Protocols, named after our successful defense against heritage destruction, which established mandatory procedures for investigating cultural crimes and supporting victimized property owners. These protocols require member nations to establish specialized heritage crime units, provide victim compensation funding, and maintain international databases for tracking criminal networks that threaten cultural resources. The economic research conducted by our foundation revealed that heritage protection generated exponentially greater financial benefits than anyone had previously calculated. Communities with comprehensive preservation programs showed average economic growth rates 40% higher than comparable areas without historic architecture. The multiplier effects included tourism revenue, skilled employment opportunities, educational programs, and enhanced property values that benefited entire regions. Corporate partnerships developed through the foundation have revolutionized funding mechanisms for heritage protection efforts. Major technology companies now provide data analysis capabilities. Financial institutions offer specialized preservation loans, and international businesses sponsor restoration projects as part of corporate social responsibility initiatives. These partnerships have generated over $200 million in private sector support for preservation activities. The educational curriculum developed from our experience is now taught in law schools, architecture programs, and public policy courses at over 400 universities worldwide. Students learn about heritage crime investigation techniques, preservation law enforcement, and community-based advocacy strategies that can be adapted to local conditions. Graduates from these programs staff preservation organizations, government agencies, and legal practices specializing in cultural heritage protection. The digital archiving project launched by the Foundation has created comprehensive three-dimensional documentation of over 50,000 historic structures across North America. These detailed scans capture architectural elements with precision that enables perfect reconstruction if original fabric is ever damaged by natural disasters or criminal activities. The archive serves as both insurance against loss and educational resource for understanding historical building techniques. Mobile response teams established through federal funding can deploy anywhere in the country within 24 hours to provide emergency assistance when heritage destruction threats are identified. These teams include preservation attorneys, structural engineers, documentation specialists, and law enforcement liaisons, who can quickly assess situations and implement appropriate protective measures before irreversible damage occurs. The judicial training programs developed through our foundation ensure that judges and prosecutors understand the unique aspects of heritage crime cases and the long-term implications of cultural destruction. Over 1,500 legal professionals have completed intensive courses covering preservation law, architectural significance assessment, and appropriate sentencing guidelines for cultural crimes. Corporate accountability measures implemented through our advocacy have established environmental and cultural impact assessments as standard requirements for major development projects. Companies must now demonstrate that proposed construction will not damage historic resources or provide comprehensive mitigation plans if impacts are unavoidable. These requirements have prevented countless heritage destruction incidents. The victim advocacy services created through our foundation provide comprehensive support for property owners facing heritage destruction threats, including emergency legal representation, financial assistance for restoration costs, counseling services for families traumatized by cultural vandalism, and ongoing support throughout prosecution proceedings. These services have assisted over 3,200 families in protecting their architectural heritage. International exchange programs funded through the Foundation bring preservation specialists from developing countries to study American heritage protection techniques, while sending American experts overseas to share knowledge about community-based preservation advocacy. These exchanges have strengthened global cooperation against cultural destruction and adapted successful strategies to diverse cultural contexts. The technology innovations sponsored by our foundation have revolutionized heritage protection capabilities through satellite monitoring systems that can detect unauthorized construction activities near historic properties, drone surveillance networks that document threatened buildings, and blockchain verification systems that create tamper-proof records of architectural authenticity. Regulatory reforms advocated by the Foundation have strengthened federal oversights of local governments and community associations that operate in historic districts. New requirements mandate annual compliance audits, public disclosure of enforcement activities, and federal review of any proposed alterations to historic properties. Non-compliance triggers automatic federal investigation and potential criminal charges for officials who violate preservation laws. The psychological support services developed through our experience help families cope with the trauma of heritage destruction threats and recover from cultural vandalism incidents. Specialized therapists understand the unique emotional impact of attacks on family heritage and ancestral properties, providing targeted interventions that address both individual trauma and community healing needs. Research partnerships with major universities have produced groundbreaking studies on the social and economic benefits of historic preservation, the psychological impacts of cultural destruction, and the effectiveness of different intervention and strategies for preventing heritage crimes. This research informs policy development at federal and international levels. Community resilience programs teach neighborhoods how to organize collective responses to heritage destruction threats, document architectural significance, and coordinate with federal agencies when professional intervention becomes necessary. Over 800 communities have implemented these programs, creating grassroots networks that provide early warning systems against cultural vandalism. The legal precedents established through Karen's prosecution have been cited in over 200 subsequent heritage crime cases, creating consistent enforcement standards and predictable consequences for cultural vandalism. Judges now have clear guidelines for sentencing heritage criminals, and prosecutors understand the federal resources available for investigating cultural destruction networks. Financial investigation capabilities developed through our case have been replicated by federal agencies worldwide, creating sophisticated tools for tracking money laundering operations that fund heritage destruction campaigns. These capabilities have identified and dismantled criminal networks operating across multiple continents, protecting thousands of historic properties from organized destruction schemes. The public awareness campaigns launched through our foundation have educated millions of people about recognizing heritage destruction threats, understanding their rights as historic property owners, and accessing resources for protecting architectural heritage. These campaigns have fundamentally changed public understanding of preservation issues and created widespread support for aggressive enforcement of heritage protection laws. Emergency response protocols developed through our experience enable rapid deployment of federal resources when heritage destruction threats are identified. Streamlined procedures allow preservation officers to obtain court injunctions within hours, while specialized task forces can intervene before irreversible damage occurs. These protocols have saved hundreds of historic properties from criminal destruction. The training academies established through federal funding provide specialized education for law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and preservation professionals who work on heritage crime cases. These academies have graduated over 2,500 specialists who now work throughout the criminal justice system, ensuring that heritage crimes receive appropriate investigation and prosecution. Legacy planning services developed by the Foundation help historic property owners create sustainable stewardship arrangements that protect architectural heritage across generations. These services include legal structures, financial planning, and educational programs that ensure historic properties remain protected even when ownership transfers occur. My morning routine in the mansion has become a meditation on the power of principled resistance and community collaboration. As I drink coffee surrounded by restored Victorian craftsmanship, I reflect on how one individual's refusal to accept cultural destruction grew into an international movement that protects human heritage worldwide. The mansion itself has become a symbol of successful heritage protection, featured in documentaries, academic studies, and news articles that inspire other communities facing similar threats. Visitors from around the world come to see how ordinary citizens can defeat organized criminal networks through knowledge, determination, and strategic cooperation with law enforcement agencies. The satisfaction of this victory extends beyond personal vindication to encompass the knowledge that our struggle created permanent protections for countless other families facing heritage destruction threats. The legal frameworks, educational resources, and enforcement mechanisms developed through our experience will protect architectural heritage long after current generations have passed. Every preserved historic building represents a victory for human culture over criminal greed, for community values over individual profit, and for future generations who deserve to inherit the architectural legacy created by their ancestors. The tools now exist to defend this inheritance against any threat, regardless of how sophisticated or well-funded the criminal networks may become. Share your heritage protection story in the comments, because every successful defense against cultural destruction strengthens the global network that protects human architectural legacy. Hit that subscribe button if you believe that historic buildings deserve protection from criminal vandalism and community cooperation can defeat organized threats to cultural heritage. Your historic property, whether it represents your family's ancestry or your community's development, deserves protection from those who would destroy irreplaceable cultural resources for temporary financial gain. The legal tools, educational resources, and international cooperation networks now exist to defend every piece of architectural heritage from criminal destruction. Remember, sometimes standing up to neighborhood tyrants doesn't just save yourself, it saves everyone around you. When good people refuse to be intimidated by fake authority, entire communities can break free from fear. Thanks for watching HOA Revenge Stories, where we prove that every HOA Karen eventually meets their match.